The year was 1923. The world was caught between two eras. The Great War had ended just a few years earlier, leaving scars in every major city. But alongside the memories of death and destruction, there was also a restless hunger for progress. Airplanes had crossed the Atlantic, radios were crackling in living rooms, and people were whispering about a coming age when science might solve every human problem. It was into this restless world that Dr. Elias Varnum arrived. On a cold March morning, a steam locomotive hissed into Chicago's Union Station. From the thick cloud of smoke stepped a tall, thin man in his early 40s. His clothes were modest, a worn brown overcoat and a bowler hat pulled low over his eyes, but his presence was quietly commanding. He carried only a single leather case, scuffed at the edges and held together by two makeshift straps. Inside it were the tools of his life's obsession, journals filled with tight, slanted handwriting, strange diagrams of the human body surrounded by sketches of sunbursts, and several small glass vials of dark green liquid. Elias Varnum was not a man who believed in small ideas. For over a decade, he had lived on the fringes of scientific respectability, working out of borrowed laboratories and makeshift greenhouses. While others studied the slow march of chemical progress, Elias was obsessed with a single, audacious thought: what if a human being could absorb the power of the sun directly? The idea had first taken root in his mind years earlier, during a famine in southern Europe. He had been there as a young medical researcher, treating malnutrition in children. It had struck him like a thunderbolt. Plants never starved. They could grow in the poorest soil so long as they had sunlight. Nature had already solved the problem of hunger. Why couldn't humans learn from it? In the scientific journals of the time, such thoughts were laughed out of existence. Human biology, they said, was fixed. The body could only survive through digestion of food. Any talk of sunlight as nourishment belonged to the realm of mysticism, not science, but Elias was undeterred. While working as a teaching assistant at a small university, he began his own experiments. He studied photosynthesis with monastic dedication, breaking down chlorophyll compounds, experimenting with diets that stripped away all but the essentials. Friends noticed him skipping meals, drinking strange green mixtures, and standing on rooftops for hours, face tilted toward the sun like a plant following the day's arc. By the winter of 1922, he had come to believe deeply believe that the human body could be trained to partially fuel itself from solar energy. His calculations suggested that if certain minerals were balanced in the blood and chlorophyll-based compounds were introduced to the digestive tract, the body might begin to convert sunlight into usable energy. It would not replace food entirely, at least, not at first, but it could dramatically reduce dependence on it. That was the dream Elias carried with him as he stepped into Chicago's cold air that March morning. Chicago was not chosen at random. It was a city of ambition, home to grand industrial projects, bold architecture, and the kind of wealthy patrons who might be persuaded to fund dangerous experiments. Elias believed he could find both a laboratory and an audience here. Yet, as visionary as he was, Elias was not blind to the risks. In his journals he had written, "Every great leap in history begins as a heresy. Those who dream beyond the known must accept ridicule as their companion and failure as their shadow." He knew that people would call him a fool or worse, a fraud. He knew his body might give out before his theories could be proven, but he also knew something else. If he succeeded, he could change the fate of humanity. From Union Station, he walked to a modest boarding house on West Madison Street. The landlady later recalled him as a polite man with eyes that didn't quite look at you, they looked past you, like he was always seeing something far away. He rented a small room and began unpacking his case. Within hours, he was writing letters to local scientific societies, wealthy industrialists, and newspaper editors, introducing himself as a medical man in pursuit of a nutritional revolution. Elias Varnum had arrived not just in Chicago, but on the edge of history. Whether the world was ready for him or not, he was determined to step into the sunlight and prove that human beings were capable of far more than anyone imagined. When Dr. Elias Varnum first stepped into his rented basement laboratory on West Madison Street. It felt nothing like the grand halls of science he had once dreamed of. The walls were cracked, the floorboards uneven, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke from the furnace upstairs. Yet for Elias, this dim little space was a cathedral, a place where he could test an idea that most of the world had already dismissed as fantasy. The experiments began in silence. Elias worked alone, unwilling to invite colleagues who might mock him, or worse, try to claim his ideas as their own. The first step was controlling his environment. He boarded up the small street level window, then cut a circular hole in the wall to fit a large lens, one of several polished mirrors he had purchased from a bankrupt observatory outside Milwaukee. These mirrors were designed to track the sun, focusing its light into a concentrated beam. Elias positioned them to flood his workbench with sunlight during the day, turning the basement into a strange, glowing chamber. His method was as simple as it was extreme. Reduce food intake to the bare minimum and gradually replace caloric energy with what he believed could be solar-derived energy. He began each day before dawn, drinking a thick green mixture of chlorophyll extracts from spinach and algae, dissolved in mineral-rich water. By mid-morning, he would strip down to his undershirt, stand under the focused beam of sunlight, and remain there for hours motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. The first week was punishing. Hunger came in waves so strong that his hands trembled. His stomach ached, his head pounded, and sleep became restless. More than once, he nearly gave up. But Elias had lived through worse: the war, the famine, and he reminded himself that great experiments were born in discomfort. In his journal, he wrote, "The body resists what the mind commands. This is not proof of impossibility, but proof that the body is loyal to habit. I must teach it new loyalty." By the second week, something curious began to happen. The hunger did not disappear, but it changed. It became lighter, less urgent, almost like an echo. He noticed his mood stabilizing during the hours spent under the light. He could work for long stretches without feeling faint, and his muscles no longer trembled with fatigue. He began keeping meticulous records of his weight, pulse, and temperature. Oddly, though his weight dropped only slightly, his pulse remained strong. Neighbors began to notice the strange man in the boarding house. Some claimed they saw a faint greenish tint to his skin when he returned from the basement. Others whispered that he was cooking himself alive with mirrors. The landlady worried about fire hazards and nearly evicted him until Elias reassured her that his work was safe, though in truth, the concentrated light could scorch paper instantly if misaligned. But Elias wasn't just experimenting on himself physically. He was training his mind to see sunlight not as warmth or brightness, but as sustenance, as something that could be consumed. He meditated on the thought that the sun's energy had been feeding life on Earth for millions of years, and that all food ultimately was sunlight in disguise. Plants converted it directly, animals ate the plants, humans ate both. Why not bypass the chain? Why not step closer to the source? By the third month, Elias felt confident enough to push further. He stopped eating solid food entirely. For nearly 14 days, he consumed nothing but his chlorophyll mixture and water. He spent a minimum of 6 hours a day in the sunlight beam, recording his sensations, heightened alertness, unusual bursts of energy in the afternoon, and a strange absence of cravings. But there were also troubling signs: dizziness when standing too quickly, a constant dryness in his mouth, and moments when his vision blurred. Still, he pressed on. Failure, he believed, was not the enemy. Indifference was. One evening, while reviewing his notes, Elias wrote a line that would later become the defining mantra of his work. If we demand the impossible, we must be willing to meet the impossible halfway. For Elias, this meant accepting that his body might never fully replace food with sunlight, but even partial success could change the world. Imagine, he thought, a future where food shortages were halved, where long voyages required no ration crates, where famine could be beaten not with charity but with biology. The trials continued quietly through the summer of 1923, each cycle pushing him closer to the limits of his endurance. And yet each morning, as the first golden rays crept into his mirror's path, Elias felt the same pull, the same certainty that he was standing on the edge of something monumental. He did not yet know that soon the world would hear about the man who ate the sun. Nor could he foresee the crowds, the headlines, or the public challenge that would test not just his theory, but his very life. For now there was only the beam of light in a Chicago basement, and a man determined to teach the human body to eat the sky. By late summer of 1923, Elias Varnum's quiet basement experiments had already begun to stir whispers in Chicago's scientific circles. A few curious physicians had visited his lab, more out of amusement than belief. They left shaking their heads, but also unable to fully explain what they had seen. A man who had consumed no solid food in weeks, yet stood before them with steady hands, clear eyes, and a mind sharp enough to recite complex chemical equations without hesitation. The real spark came from a single newspaper article. A small column in the Chicago Tribune, printed on September 2nd, carried the headline, "Is this man living on sunlight?" The article, though skeptical, described Elias as a man of curious vigor, and hinted that he was preparing for a public test. That was all it took. Within days, letters began arriving at his boarding house, some from people begging for proof, some from doctors warning him of certain death, and some from investors asking how they might patent his sun-eating formula. Among those who wrote was industrialist Henry Stokely, a wealthy man with a taste for spectacle. Stokely believed in the power of publicity and saw Elias's work not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a show the whole city would pay to see. He offered Elias the use of the Chicago Science Hall for a public demonstration. The terms were simple. Elias would go 21 days without food, under public observation, consuming only water, his chlorophyll drink, and sunlight. Elias hesitated. His work was delicate, unfinished, but part of him burned for the chance to prove himself before the world. After years of ridicule, he could finally force his critics to face what he had discovered. The announcement spread quickly. On the morning of September 12th, a crowd gathered outside the Science Hall. Inside, a small room had been prepared with a bed, a chair, and a tall contraption of mirrors and lenses to focus sunlight onto a standing platform. Doctors from local hospitals were assigned to check his vitals daily. A glass panel separated him from the public, ensuring no food could be smuggled in. The first day felt almost easy. Elias greeted visitors through the glass, answering questions from reporters and explaining his theory to anyone who would listen. Children pressed their noses to the glass. A few men laughed openly, calling him a fraud. Elias ignored them. By the 5th day, the novelty began to fade for the crowd, but Elias's presence drew a steady trickle of onlookers, farmers curious about ending hunger, ministers quoting scripture about man not living by bread alone, and skeptics who wanted to witness a breakdown. By the 10th day, Elias could feel the weight of the experiment. His body was lighter, his clothes hanging looser on his frame. The chlorophyll drink began to taste bitter. His throat often dry despite constant water. But the sunlight sessions still gave him bursts of clarity, like a fire being stoked inside him. The press coverage grew bolder. Human plant, Varnum still standing, 10 days without food, miracle or madness. By the 15th day, the stakes were clear. Elias's cheeks had hollowed and his steps were slower. The doctors noted mild dehydration and warned him of muscle breakdown. Henry Stokely urged him to end the trial early, fearing a death in his hall would ruin his reputation. But Elias refused. "If I stop now," he told the doctors, "it will be because I listened to fear, and fear has never built anything worth keeping." The final week became a test of willpower as much as science. Crowds swelled again, sensing the climax. Some came to cheer him on. Others came expecting, even hoping to see him collapse. The Science Hall became a strange theater, the glass wall a stage curtain, Elias the lone actor in a drama of endurance. On the 19th day, during his afternoon sunlight session, his vision blurred. The faces beyond the glass became indistinct shapes. His knees buckled, and he caught himself on the frame of the mirror stand. Gasps rippled through the room. Doctors rushed in, ending the session. He sat on the bed, his breathing ragged. Reporters leaned in against the glass, cameras flashing. One doctor asked if he wanted the trial stopped. Elias looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong, not about the sun, but about man." It was an answer few understood in the moment, but it would become the most quoted line of his career. The demonstration ended 2 days short of the 21-day goal. To some, it was proof he had failed. To others, it was undeniable evidence that his method had sustained him longer than medical science could explain. Whatever the verdict, the world now knew the name Elias Varnum, the man who had dared to eat the sun in full view of the public. The 19th day of Elias Varnum's public experiment began like all the others with the slow, careful preparation of his mirror apparatus and the measured sip of his chlorophyll drink. The science hall was quieter than usual in the morning, but by midday the audience had filled again. Some faces had been there every day, as if witnessing history unfold was a duty. Others came for the drama, expecting the final act to end with either triumph or tragedy. From behind the glass wall, Elias could feel the weight of their eyes on him. His own reflection in the polished mirror startled him. His once lean face had hollowed to sharp edges, and faint shadows pooled beneath his eyes. His skin was pale in the shade but glowed faintly when the concentrated sunlight touched it, giving him the strange plant-like appearance that had fed the tabloids' human plant headlines. The first hour in the sunlight passed without incident. He stood barefoot on the platform, eyes closed, breathing deeply, imagining the sun's energy pouring into him, filling the void where food once was. But by the second hour, something shifted. It began as a faint ringing in his ears. Then the edges of his vision darkened, the crowd beyond the glass fading into a blur. He swayed slightly, gripping the frame of the mirror. A murmur rippled through the room. The journalist's pencils stopped scratching. "Sit down, Varnum," one of the attending doctors called through the glass. Elias shook his head, straightened his back, and lifted his face toward the sunlight again. But the strength he'd been drawing from for nearly 3 weeks had thinned to a fragile thread. His breathing quickened, the ringing grew louder. He could hear his own heartbeat, deep and uneven. Then his legs buckled. Gasps erupted from the audience. The doctors moved quickly, unlocking the door and stepping onto the platform. One caught him under the arms before he struck the floor. Elias's head lolled forward, his lips pale and cracked. They guided him to the bed in the corner, checking his pulse, which was rapid and weak. A stethoscope pressed to his chest. The lead doctor muttered something about cardiac strain and electrolyte loss. They urged him to drink water, but his hand trembled so badly he could barely hold the cup. The flash of cameras lit up the room. Reporters jostled for position. Some called out questions. "Mr. Varnum, do you admit it's over? Was it all a stunt? What do you say to the critics who called you insane?" Elias lifted his head slowly, his gaze drifting past the shouting crowd to the sunlight still streaming through the mirrors. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden hush, every word carried, "I was wrong, not about the sun, but about man." The doctors glanced at each other, unsure what he meant. But Elias, despite his exhaustion, seemed to want to explain. He spoke haltingly, between breaths. "I thought if a man could take his energy from the sun, he would be free from hunger, from greed, from dependence on others. But freedom doesn't come from the body, it comes from the mind, from the will to use what we already have." He paused, closing his eyes as though gathering strength for the last lines. "I pushed this body past its limits, thinking the answer was in the mechanics, but it's here." He touched his temple weakly, "and here." He pressed his palm to his chest. The real power was never about eating the sun. It was about believing you could change the impossible, and still knowing when to stop before you destroy yourself. The attending doctor, realizing the strain these words were causing, motioned for silence. But the hall was already silent. The only sounds were the faint hum of the crowd outside and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. That evening, the science hall doors were locked, and Elias was moved to a quiet room in a private clinic. The public demonstration was declared over. Headlines the next day split between condemnation and awe. Sun-eating hoax collapses in final hours. Varnum proves mind over matter nearly pays with life privately. Some physicians admitted they were baffled. While clearly weakened, Elias had lasted far longer than any fasting subject they'd observed, and without the dramatic organ failure they'd anticipated. The chlorophyll compounds and intense sunlight exposure had done something just not what Elias had hoped. For Elias himself, the collapse was both defeat and revelation. Lying in the clinic bed, he wrote in his journal, "The body is a marvelous servant but a terrible master. If you teach it to obey the will, it will follow you further than you think possible, but the will must also know mercy, for without it, all victories turn to ash." The public would remember the collapse as the moment the man who ate the sun met his limits. Elias would remember it as the moment he understood the true nature of his experiment, that the greatest energy source was not above us in the sky, but within us in the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to dream beyond reason. After the collapse, the newspapers moved on quickly. For a few weeks, Elias Varnum's name was printed in bold headlines alongside words like failure, fraud, and reckless. Soon, those headlines gave way to political scandals, boxing matches, and sensational crime stories. In the public's eye, he was just another eccentric who had tried something foolish and been humbled. But legacies are not built in the heat of public opinion. They are shaped in the quiet years that follow, when the noise fades and the truth has time to breathe. Elias did not return to the science hall. Instead, he retreated to a cabin in the Arizona desert, far from the city's ridicule and winter's gray skies. The desert offered what he needed most: relentless sunlight, silence, and time. His body, worn thin from the experiment, began to heal. His mind, however, refused to rest. In the stillness of the desert mornings, he would sit on the porch, watching the horizon catch fire with the rising sun. He kept a notebook always within reach, filling page after page, not with plans to restart the same experiment, but with reflections on what it had truly meant. He realized that his attempt to eat the sun had been only half about biology. The other half had been about the human spirit, about daring to chase an idea so large that it could not fit neatly into the accepted boundaries of science or comfort. Visitors were rare, but not absent. Every so often, a young student, a curious journalist, or a wandering scientist would make the long journey to see him. They expected to find a bitter man nursing the wounds of failure. Instead, they found someone calm, almost amused at his own legend. "I didn't fail," he would say, leaning back in his chair. "I just learned the experiment I needed to run wasn't the one I started." Some of those visitors left with more than just a story. Elias would hand them pages of his research sketches of plant cells, mineral charts, and early notes on the use of solar energy. A few of these pages found their way into the hands of forward-thinking engineers in the 1940s, influencing the earliest experiments with artificial photosynthesis. Others inspired medical researchers to explore micronutrient therapies and alternative nutritional support methods. Decades later, as humanity inched toward space exploration, a handful of scientists dusted off his writings. The challenge of sustaining life beyond Earth had rekindled interest in the possibility of harnessing sunlight for direct human benefit. Though no one ever replicated his exact methods, his insistence that human biology could adapt in ways yet unseen sparked avenues of research in solar-powered food production, algae-based nutrition, and metabolic resilience. But Elias's truest legacy was not found in laboratories or patents. It was in the way people spoke of him, not as a perfect scientist, but as a man who tried. In the industrial districts of Chicago, workers told the story of the man who stood in the sunlight until he almost died. As a parable about stubbornness and vision, in universities, professors mentioned him during lectures on experimental ethics as a reminder that boldness must be balanced with caution. Among dreamers, his name was spoken with a mix of admiration and warning, a symbol of the fine line between courage and self-destruction. In his final years, Elias summed it up best in a letter to a friend. "You cannot control how the world remembers you. Some will call you a fool, others a prophet. The truth is usually somewhere between the two. What you can control is whether you lived in such a way that the story is worth telling at all." Elias Varnum died quietly in 1957 at the age of 76 in the same desert cabin where he had sought refuge after the Science Hall experiment. He left no fortune, no heirs, and no formal recognition from the scientific establishment. But on the dusty bookshelf beside his desk, there remained a stack of worn notebooks, his life's work, written in tight, slanted handwriting. Those notebooks would later be donated to a small archive, where they sat for years before anyone realized their significance. When they were finally studied, historians agreed on one point: whether or not his science had been sound, Elias's belief in the human capacity to adapt was ahead of its time. Today, his story survives not as proof that man can live on sunlight, but as proof that man can live for a dream even when the dream seems impossible. His life reminds us that the measure of success is not always in what we achieve, but in the scale of what we dare to attempt. For those who stand at the edge of an idea so big it terrifies them, Elias Varnum's story still carries its quiet challenge: step into the light, even if you are not sure it will hold you. The attempt itself may be the most enduring part of your legacy. When the story of Elias Varnum is told, people focus on the spectacle. A man standing in a beam of concentrated sunlight for hours each day, refusing food and daring to challenge one of nature's most basic laws. But if that is all we take away from his life, we have missed the point entirely. Elias's true message was never about proving that humans could live on sunlight. It was about proving that humans could live for something bigger than themselves. We live in a world that rewards safety. It encourages us to stay within the lines, follow proven paths, and avoid risks that might make us look foolish. The problem is, greatness never comes from comfort zones. Every advancement, every breakthrough, every story worth telling began with someone stepping beyond what was safe, acceptable, or possible. Elias understood this. When he began his work, the scientific community didn't just doubt him, they ridiculed him. He was called a charlatan, a crank, and even a danger to himself, and yet he kept going. Why? Because the worth of a dream is not measured by how many people believe in it, it's measured by how deeply you are willing to fight for it. Elias could have quit 100 times, when the hunger gnawed at him, when the reporters mocked him, when his own body began to falter. Every one of those moments was a chance to stop, but he didn't. Not because he was stubborn for the sake of stubbornness, but because he understood a truth most people never learn. Commitment is not about pursuing your dream when it's easy. It's about pursuing it when it costs you something. But his collapse on the 19th day taught him something just as valuable, and this is where many miss the heart of his story. He learned that strength is not only in pushing forward, it's also in knowing when to step back. Courage without wisdom can destroy the very thing you're fighting for. In his own words, the real power was never about eating the sun. It was about believing you could change the impossible, and still knowing when to stop before you destroy yourself. That balance between relentless pursuit and humble self-awareness is the tightrope every dreamer must walk. Push too little and your dream dies from neglect. Push too hard and you may break yourself before you ever reach it. For us, the lesson is clear: dare to dream bigger than is comfortable. Elias's idea was outrageous, but outrageous ideas are the seeds of change. Prepare for ridicule. If your dream is truly new, people will laugh. Let them. Their laughter doesn't change the truth of your vision. Commit past the point of comfort. Anyone can keep going when it's easy. What matters is whether you keep going when it's hard. Know your limits. Stopping doesn't always mean quitting. Sometimes it means living to fight another day. Leave something behind. Even if you fall short, your attempt can inspire others to go further. When Elias died, he hadn't changed human biology, but he had changed human imagination. He proved that there are still people willing to step into the light for what they believe in, even when the light burns, and that is rare. Most people spend their lives waiting for perfect conditions, for enough money, enough time, enough support, enough certainty. They don't realize that conditions are never perfect. The people who make history are the ones who move forward anyway, ready to adapt, ready to fail, and ready to try again. Elias's story forces us to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. What is the sun? In my life, the thing so far beyond my reach that chasing it would make people question my sanity. Have I been living small because I'm afraid of how I might look if I fail? If I started today, knowing I might never fully succeed, would the attempt still be worth it? If your answer to that last question is yes, then you already understand Elias Varnum's lesson. The outcome is not the only thing that matters. The act of striving, of standing in the light, even when you're unsure it will sustain you, shapes you in ways that comfort never will. And perhaps that is the real way to eat the sun. Not to physically absorb it, but to let its heat, its brilliance, and its daring become part of you, to live so brightly and with such purpose that your life itself becomes a source of energy for others. Because in the end, Elias's greatest gift to us wasn't a formula or a scientific method. It was a challenge to step into the light of our own impossible dreams, and to keep stepping forward until the world is forced to look up and see us there.